Good afternoon, class. This is Mr. Kraft, and welcome to our weekly lecture and introduction to our next unit. A few comments on last week's discussion forum. I thought it was very well done. I commend each of you for your level of participation in that discussion forum and keeping those threads going. In terms of what is good literature, I think we can conclude globally or universally from all of our comments that good literature is something that is in the eye of the beholder. Many of you focused on the structure or technique of writing. Many of you also focused on more of the reader response mechanism about what makes literature good to me is what I get from it, how I respond to it. And literature that makes me respond favorably, I'm going to deem as good literature. All of those are correct answers. There's no wrong answer here. I want you to come away from this course understanding that literature is exactly that. Literature should mean something to you. You are able to define it in ways that you deem appropriate, and we're going to learn some critical methods that will help you do that during the course of this semester. Additionally, understand that literature encompasses more than just written words and books. Literature can be multimedia, it can be film. You can view television and film in much of the same way that you read literature using some of the same critical methods. Similarly, you can view things on the internet, multimedia presentations on the internet, etc. So keep that in mind as you go throughout this semester. This week, we are embarking on our study of American literature with two very famous short stories, short pieces of short fiction. The first is by F. Scott Fitzgerald, entitled Winter Dreams. The second is Death in the Woods by Sherwood Anderson. At first blush and on the surface level, these appear to be two very different stories, but I'm going to ask as you read those to find the connections, find the similarities between these two stories, both thematically and perhaps structurally or stylistically. A little bit about Winter Dreams. If you have read The Great Gatsby, as many of you I know have because you commented on that work by F. Scott Fitzgerald in the first discussion forum as an example of good literature or great literature, you will find that Winter Dreams is strikingly familiar. Winter Dreams, even according to F. Scott Fitzgerald himself in some interviews during his lifetime, suggested it was a precursor to The Great Gatsby, indeed a rough draft, if you will, of The Great Gatsby, and I think you're going to see that. If you wish to incorporate that in some of your answers in the discussion forum, feel free to do so, because I think that's a worthwhile discussion to have. The story itself was first published in December of 1922 in Metropolitan Magazine. F. Scott Fitzgerald really earned his money during his lifetime not from his novels, but by selling short stories. So he was a fairly prolific short story writer. He did not write that many novels, as you may know, of course, the most famous being The Great Gatsby. He led a difficult life in some respects. He had a serious alcohol problem. He died of alcoholism in his early 40s. He died in 1940. Of course, he was married to Zelda Sayer. Zelda was very famous in her own right in the 1920s in the Jazz Age. They were very famous socialites. If the paparazzi existed in the 1920s, they would have been followed incessantly and hounded to death by the paparazzi. They were celebrities at that point in time. But F. Scott Fitzgerald felt in many respects during his lifetime that he was a failed writer. He had many self-doubts about the success of his writing. And in fact, it was not until many decades later that his writing became recognized as some of the finest in all of American literature. And The Great Gatsby ranked now by most scholars and critics as one of the finest novels that we have in the American canon. Sherwood Anderson, a different type of writer, clearly a master of characterization, and you will find that out when you read this story. And if you've read any of his other stories, particularly those collected in his collection Winesburg, Ohio, which came out in 1919. This story, Death in the Woods, came out in 1933 in a collection of the same name, and it became quite famous. He is known for his characterization, particularly his characterization of the grotesque. That is, those characters that are seen with great flaws, either physical flaws, mental flaws, or a combination of that, that tend to stand out, and they thematically become very important in the story. So look for that. This is an early use of the grotesque that we will see come to its fruition with William Faulkner, Eudora Welty, and Flannery O'Connor, which we will read next week. So pay attention to the characterization using the grotesque motif. Also, one thing I want you to pay attention to in Sherwood Anderson's story is the use of the narrator, and whether that narrator is reliable or unreliable. A reliable narrator is a narrator that you can believe, a narrator that you believe is telling you the truth about what has transpired, about the other characters, etc. An unreliable narrator is just the opposite one. You're not sure if he or she is telling you the entire truth. You're not sure if he's giving you the honest to goodness truth about the other characters or what has happened, etc. So determine whether this narrator in Sherwood Anderson's story is reliable or unreliable. See what you can make of that. Also, I want you to compare Death in the Woods when we read A Worn Path by Eudora Welty next week. Make some comparisons there. So keep the story in mind as we move forward to the following weeks. Sherwood Anderson was a failed businessman. He had haunts of his failures in the business world before he became a successful writer. So there are some corollaries between his life and the life of F. Scott Fitzgerald, although Sherwood Anderson was a little bit older than F. Scott Fitzgerald. But Sherwood Anderson died in 1941. The year after F. Scott Fitzgerald died, they were contemporaries in the writing scene, certainly in the 1920s, and both garnered a degree of fame in the 1920s. Sherwood Anderson even lived in the city of New Orleans for a while and is said to have influenced, and I believe that's true, influenced Faulkner and some of the other great Southern writers. So anyway, as you are going through the selections this week, one of the things I'll ask you to focus on is how do these stories reflect the American dream? The American dream is a motif that began in American literature shortly after the Civil War, really in the 1870s, with what are called the rags to riches stories, which were popularized by a writer named Horatio Alger. Ragged Dick was one of his more famous stories. Went through our period of naturalism and realism, very realistic fiction, if you will, Theodore Dreiser and some other famous writers during that period. And it essentially showed the exceptionalism of America, that if you were a hard worker and you believed in certain things and you were committed to your ideals, that you could rise above poverty and you too could become very successful, very rich, very famous, very powerful. However, by the modern period, which we begin after World War I, so in around 1918 or so, some suggest the modern period really begins with the advent of World War I in 1914, the end of what's called the long 19th century, from 1800 to 1914. That in this modern period, we start to see the underbelly of the American dream, the dark side of the American dream. So I'll ask that you consider what each of these stories have to say about the dark side of the American dream, and think about that as you read them. So I'll be posting a discussion forum question or two for you. You'll do the same thing that you did last week. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me, and I'll be happy to get back with you. And I look forward to seeing you on the discussion boards. Bye-bye.